Well, welcome back. Of course, we are back here in Parliament as we finish off the countdown then to that medium-term budget policy statement then by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. As I said, less than 5 minutes to go. We will perhaps get some final thoughts then from Daniel Silk, political economy analyst, joining us. As you can tell, there are a few ministers as well coming through before coming into Parliament as well. The walk up, of course, there. Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma there as well, headed up towards the parliamentary precinct as well, headed towards inside Parliament. We'll continue to try and get those shots, of course, and try to see as well as the Minister Tito Mboweni heads into Parliament as well in a moment or two, and hopefully give you those images. Daniel, your final thoughts perhaps? It's been one where we've spoken pretty much about everything at length, and you can't really say a little any more than just the expectation that he needs to be clear in his messaging.
Clearly the messaging has to be clear, and he's got to also read the Riot Act probably to his own political party as well as to where change has to come. But of course,
he's certainly the man to do it, right? He could do almost anything at this point.
He's a maverick kind of finance minister. I like that because he can really break with the normal tradition. And I think that's important, and let's see if he will. But it's also a very important speech because he's talking to the global community, to the global investor community in particular. Moody's breathing down our throats, global investors being asked to contribute large sums of money to invest in South Africa. It's not just a speech to depressed South Africans, it's a speech to try and encourage the global community to wake up and listen to South Africa again in what has become a very competitive environment, but also a global economy that's undergoing some strains as well. There's a lot of different constituencies listening to him.
In finding the right constituency as well, then to address with each matter, the question becomes, do they all follow him? Because, you know, as Angelo said a little bit earlier on, you may have leadership, but you still then need followers to actually take on your message and run with it.
Well, I think that depends on how he frames his message today. If the message is really serious, if the Riot Act is read within to his own party members sitting there, because he doesn't need to read the Riot Act to me. He needs to read the Riot Act to those caucus members, to the NEC, to decision makers within the ANC. If he frames the message correctly, then I think there can be a difference.
As we continue to see parliamentary spokespeople as well as parliamentarians sort of coming up as well then to Parliament. We're continuing to give you the latest as we head towards it. Speech should be starting in a moment or two then, of course, and these are perhaps a few late arrivals then into this into Parliament there as well. Daniel, finally, growth will become another factor, and they do need to downgrade their growth projections. Around 1.5% was predicted at some stage for this year. There's no ways we're getting there now.
Yeah, I think the realistic message is going to hit home in this budget. It's going to be, you know, the 0.6 or 0.7 GDP growth in line with the IMF and World Bank predictions. And I think we're going to be told just how much short we are in terms of revenue generation. So it'll be a serious message, I think, to South Africans.
Yeah, how scary will it be then to, or how much, at what point will we be so sufficiently scared, if I can call it that, for the fact that we don't have enough sort of put forward in terms of our taxes? I say that now as, of course, the minister there, Tito Mboweni, does come up to Parliament there with his right hand, if I could call it that, Mr. David Masondo, the Deputy Minister as well, the Director General behind in there, Dondo Mohejane, Edward Kiswet, of course, from SARS is also in the mix with the spokesperson there, the newly appointed spokesperson, Mashudu Masuta Ramotla as well. Of course, the shoes has been an interesting facet and an interesting conversation of late. The finance minister's shoes seemingly not the same ones this time around. So National Treasury has perhaps increased the budget, as for just the shoes in particular then for the minister. So certainly trying to find some sort of funny sentiments before heading into the speech, of course, there at the MTBPS 2019. Daniel, very finally, I suppose then we'll get current thoughts, and we'll obviously hopefully get to chat to you afterwards just with regards to what your final perhaps assessment is of what is happening and what the finance minister said. But in giving a throwaway to the likes of Moody's, to the investor community at large, a lot of them will ask themselves, are we serious? we haven't looked serious because we haven't implemented the things we've said for some time. So how important is it that we actually do that and get that right? And in saying this, Daniel, I just want to very quickly say hello as well to our SABC2 viewers and really welcome them to the broadcast. Of course, we just moments away then from the Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, delivering the MTBPS, that's the medium-term budget policy statement here in Parliament. We are joining you, of course, live, and we'll head straight into the Parliament itself when he does kick off his speech. But Daniel, as I was making note there, investors will want us to be a whole lot more serious.
Yeah, well, they're going to want us to be credible. We need to be a credible investor destination, and we need to hold our heads high when it comes to ethical governance in particular, which has been a weakness within South Africa. If we can convince them that there is a turnaround in place, and I think there is good evidence from this administration that some work has been done on that turnaround. Well, we know there's been institutional reform in South Africa, new heads, new boards, a new commitment to this kind of new government style that we so desperately need. Then I think you can begin to claw back that interest from both domestic and foreign investors. But it's a long clawback, and it mustn't also fall back into the old way of doing business if the political factors that we've spoken about before become more dominant. And that's the fine line for the minister. How does he take the credible message, the constraints of his own political party, the distrust that already exists, can he put it in a pot, and can he bring out something that shows the seriousness of the moment and that we are ready now to finally confront that?
Surely his colleagues, though, are at a point where they're saying to themselves, you know what, actually we need to get some stuff done now, because it's as we've said before, the tire has now hit the road.
No, I think so. I think that there's frustration all round. I think within the ANC, there's great frustration as well that the party hasn't been able to really take the bull by the horn, so to speak, and get on with proper policy making. But of course, the proof will be in the pudding over the course of the next year or so. We'll have to wait until the budget, probably in February or end of February, to get much more clarity on some of these issues. I think what we're going to see is a statement of intent, and I hope that it really is a convincing statement of intent.
Yeah. Daniel, thank you so much for the time, of course, continuing to join us. We are just, of course, into Parliament there, as you can see, as we perhaps get things underway in a moment or two. The Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, will then address the House then with the medium-term budget policy statement as to where exactly South Africa goes over the medium-term framework. That's over the next 3 years, of course. Let's remember that no major tax pronouncements are expected to be made in this medium-term budget policy statement, but we may get hints of where exactly South Africa's infrastructure, when it comes to growth, when it comes to financial accountability as well, may exactly be of keen interest. SABC News will continue to have the roundup as well of all the information and all that's happening across today's broadcast. We will also
I now recognize the Honorable the Minister of Finance. Okay.
Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly, President of the Republic of South Africa, Cabinet colleagues, Deputy Ministers, members of the Executive Councils here present, Governor of the South African Reserve Bank and Deputy Governor, leaders of all political parties in this democratic parliament, representatives of organized business and labor, honorable members, fellow South Africans. Today is my singular honor and privilege to table the 23rd medium-term budget policy statement of the democratic era. This is the first budget policy statement of the 6th administration and parliament. The medium-term budget policy statement is an important piece of the budgeting process. The first statement, if I might remind members, was published on the 2nd of December 1997 during the first democratic administration led by President Utata Nelson Mandela. Today we publish the medium-term budget policy statement containing, number one, a summary of government's fiscal goals and objectives. Two, projections for the economy and the public finances. 3 long-term projections of the debt to GDP ratio, assuming different scenarios. The baseline projection assumes we make minimal policy changes. 4, a fiscal risk statement. The medium-term policy statement does not include detailed spending plans or tax proposals. That is for the annual budget, which is normally introduced in February. If I may just pause here to emphasize that this is not the budget, because many people at home are thinking that today Minister Mboweni is presenting the budget. That is not the case. So let's temper down the expectations. So no request for further monies or anything else. The medium-term budget policy statement that we table today coincides with another important government process, the tabling of the tax bills. I am grateful to the Standing and Select Committees on Appropriations and Finance that which have the responsibility for steering the consideration of the tax bills, giving effect to the revenue proposals as announced in the 2019 annual budget in February, and obviously the related tax administration matters, as well as the 2019 Division of Revenue Amendment Bill and the 2019 Adjustments Appropriation Bill. As the 1997 policy statement said, and I quote, "There is no point publishing a policy statement if it simply means publishing the budget 3 months earlier. The purpose is to open up the debate before the actual budget is finalized," unquote. I look forward to this debate. I will follow this debate in person, on the wireless, on TV, term budget policy statement for consideration of the House and of all South Africans. Today, I also table the Adjustments Appropriation Bill, the Rates and Monetary Amounts and Amendment of Revenue Laws Bill, the Taxation Laws Amendment Bill, the Division of Revenue Amendment Bill, the Tax Administration Laws Amendment Bill, and finally, the 2019 Adjusted Estimates of National Expenditure. Deputy Chair, on Budget Day 2019, I brought a resilient aloe ferox plant. Mr. President, on a cheeky note, let me say that you might remember that I also presented to Your Excellency an aloe ferox plant, which I'm very confident that it is still alive and growing, because its health and growth signifies an important element of the South African economy. This little aloe ferox is emerging from a long winter. During that winter, the ground became hard, the leaves fell from the trees, and the air was bitterly cold. We toiled, hoping for better days. Our people became poorer. Some of them lost their jobs. Mr. Deputy Speaker, here we stand at the end of winter. The food cupboards are almost bare. We have been shuffling about in old and comfortable brown shoes. Our expenditure continues to exceed our revenue. Our national debt is increasing at an unsustainable pace. The economy is not performing that well. In these difficult times, we have turned against one another, unfortunately. We have regrettably turned against our brothers and sisters from the rest of the continent. We should inculcate in the minds of our people that we are all Africans. Worst of all, we have turned against our sisters, our daughters, and our mothers. This is not who we are. We should give renewed impetus to the fight against gender-based violence and xenophobia. So what should we do? Hope is good, but it is not a strategy. As any farmer will tell you, if you want a bumper harvest, you must be prepared to work hard during the end of winter and early spring. Because what you do to the soil then determines how successful your crop will be. Now is the time. We cannot wait any longer. If we want a successful harvest, we must act today. Mr. President, so that I don't disappoint, let me say, as the good book says, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 2, I think. If you want to reap sparingly, you must sow sparingly. If you want to reap bountifully, you must also sow bountifully. Unquote. Amen. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6. As I've said somewhere, we need to rock the boat. We need to shake the baobab tree. We need to do the unusual. We need to disrupt the comfort zones to get things moving. What is the state of the world? After a decade-long economic expansion, growth in advanced economies is expected to slow, in parts due to trade tensions and the Brexit uncertainty. The International Monetary Fund estimates that these tensions may take away 0.8 percentage points from global growth. Economic growth in both China and India is expected to slow to about 6.1% this year. Growth in both these countries accelerated after far-reaching structural reforms. The average person in China today is 7 times richer than 25 years ago. The average person in India has become 3.5 times richer over the same period. Meanwhile, the average South African is only 1.3 times better. Growth in emerging markets is lower partly because of the global slowdown, but also due to domestic policy missteps, which we can avoid. Economic growth in Mexico is down sharply. Its own state-owned energy company, Pemex, will cost approximately $2.6 billion a year to fix. The Brazilian economy will most likely grow at 0.9% in 2019. There, the state-owned energy company, Petrobras, has its own big problems. Closer to home, things are much better. The African continent has a young, growing, entrepreneurial population. Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to grow by 3.6% next year, the second fastest growing region after Asia, excluding Japan. Like Eliud Kipchoge, the Kenyan economy is racing ahead, but not at that speed. Growth is expected in Kenya to be 6% next year. In Ghana, after extremely difficult structural reforms, growth is expected to be 7.5% this year and 5.6% next year. Ethiopia is expected to grow by over 7% in this period. They clearly have new shoes. Why don't we? In the first quarter of this year, the South African economy contracted by a revised 3.1% on a seasonally adjusted and annualized basis. As energy constraints lifted, growth rebounded to 3.1% in the second quarter. These two quarters canceled each other out, and this year, growth has been flat. There are some signs that investment spending is strengthening. In the second quarter, growth in gross fixed capital formation rebounded to 6.1%. Mining grew by 14.4%. In real terms, credit growth has been positive since late 2018. Private sector credit extension rose 6.2% in September. Home loans grew 5% year on year, the fastest rate in some time. But corporate credit extension has softened, which is an issue of concern. In September, headline consumer price inflation was 4.1%. Lower inflation is good for everyone, particularly the poor and the working class. In short, what we have here is a mixed picture with some positive signs. It is our job to chart a course that is sober, strategic, and inclusive. The economy is now forecast to grow at 0.5% in 2019 compared to 1.5% expected in February. Growth is projected to slowly rise to 1.7% in 2022, a situation which is not pleasing at all. Fellow South Africans, the preamble to our Constitution gives us a commitment by all to do the following. Quote, improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each citizen, unquote. The growth outlook is far too low to support this vision of the founders of our democratic society. We therefore need to accelerate economic performance. Under the leadership of President Ramaphosa, the structural reform agenda contained in the National Development Plan has been given a new life. We have made progress in the following. Firstly, the new integrated resource plan has been gazetted. Second, the infrastructure fund is being rolled out. Third, the visa regime has been greatly simplified. Fourth, the unabridged birth certificate requirement for young tourists has been abolished. Fifthly, we have upgraded a number of industrial parks and 10 special economic zones have been approved. 6, Cabinet has directed ICASA to accelerate the leasing of high-demand broadband spectrum, and we're falling behind schedule in the race for 5G. Our paper titled Economic Transformation, Inclusive Growth and Competitiveness Towards an Economic Strategy for South Africa draws lessons from fast-growing emerging and sub-Saharan African economies. The paper speaks for itself, but in brief, we argue that there are a number of important growth ingredients. Firstly, an efficient and capable state. Second, prudent fiscal and monetary policy. Third, a competitive and flexible exchange rate. 4, a trade regime which promotes open and beneficial trade, particularly with the rest of the African continent. 5th, a reimagined industrial strategy. 6, opening a network industries platform, that is transport, logistics, and telecommunications. This means reorganizing ESCOM and other state-owned entities. 7th, lowering barriers to entry. The president yesterday spoke to me and my colleagues at length about 2 difficulties that he has in life. One, it took him 3 years to obtain a water license on his property. 3 years. And now it's taking him an endless amount of time just to flatten the ground outside his house for parking, because permission from the city of Cape Town is difficult. 8, prioritizing job-creating sectors such as agriculture and tourism. 9, an overarching legal framework with an independent judiciary and strong property rights. 10, a well-functioning banking and financial sector. The country is having a rigorous debate about these proposals. We received over 103 comments so far. Proposals included ideas on, for example, the digital economy, streamlining applications for new ports, and opening up the railway network to force heavy freight off our roads to ease congestion and improve safety. Mr. President, your comment at the first meeting of the President's Council of Economic Advisors was, and I quote, "Implementation of these initiatives will improve confidence and restore credibility," unquote. To judge from the many supportive comments received, many South Africans agree with you, Mr. President, as do local and international business, large and small. I coined a new phrase. It's called large, small, medium, and tiny. Tiny businesses. Thank you to everyone who joined in the debate, who wrote letters, held conferences, wrote articles in various publications, and issued press releases. We can do some of the things urgently. Already the new integrated resources plan charts a greener course forward on energy. We can accelerate spectrum licensing and move towards 5G. We can make it easier to do business. Mr. President, a critical youth employment initiative has been driven by yourselves. We have supported the Youth Employment Service, known as YES, through expanding the Employment Tax Initiative. We look forward to the YES Initiative board bringing forward new innovative ideas. Today we publish version 2 of the document. It is a living document, and as such, it is, quote, not a dogma, but a guide to action, unquote. That reminds me of my young political days. Where appropriate, we will consider legislation. To meet our fiscal needs, growth is not enough. We also need a well-functioning and efficient revenue collection agency. The South African Revenue Service is emerging from its own winter. Cabinet has approved that we implement the findings of the Nugent Commission of Inquiry into tax administration and governance. And I intend to table a bill early next year in this regard. The President has appointed Mr. Edward Kieswetter as the new Commissioner of SARS. Since he started work in May, he has already taken steps to reinvigorate and reestablish the large business center unit and the litigation, integrity, and compliance units. Leadership, staffing, and procurement failures are also being addressed. Achieving a more inclusive South Africa relies on honest taxpayers. Without your taxes, fellow South Africans, our country will not succeed. Thank you to all those who have honored their obligations thus far, but we have a few more hours to complete your tax returns. Because we must render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, or else Caesar has a tendency of breaking your bones. But you have told us, fellow South Africans, that we must spend your hard-earned money better, and we could not agree more with you. We now expect to collect 1.37 trillion rand this year. This is 53 billion rand, or 4% less than what we expected. Looking forward, our revenue forecasts are prudent. We assume an elasticity of 1, which means a 1-to-1 relationship between growth in taxes and economic growth after adjusting for tax measures. We are assuming an elasticity of 1, which means a 1-to-1 relationship between tax, growth in tax, and economic growth after adjusting for tax measures. You can Google it in the meantime. The fiscal framework has weakened substantially since the February budget, mainly due to weaker economic growth and lower revenues, as I tried to explain the formula above. The main changes to the in-year expenditure projections are, firstly, 26 billion rand in additional financial support to Eskom. Secondly, 11 billion rand to several smaller state-owned companies in financial distress. Thirdly, 430 million rand approved through the budget facility for infrastructure for student housing. These increases are partly offset by drawing on the contingency reserve, provisional allocations, and declared unspent funds. That said, savings from the compensation measures announced in the budget in February have not materialized as expected. Thus, in total, non-interest spending rises by 23 billion rand this year relative to the February estimates. If we exclude Eskom support, non-interest spending would have been 2.9 billion rand less than expected. The consolidated budget deficit is now projected at 5.9% of GDP in the current year. I just need to explain this to people in the media who have seen a different picture. This is a consolidated number that you're seeing now. This year, the national debt exceeded 3 trillion rand. It exceeded 3 trillion rand. It is expected to rise to 4.5 trillion in the next 3 years. Clearly, we need to do things differently. As things stand, without any policy adjustments, debt will most likely exceed 70% of GDP by 2022-23. This is a serious position that we find ourselves in. Our little Arlo Ferox is not doing very well, Mr. President. It needs attention, like our public finances. Honorable members, there's no status quo option. Stabilization involves difficult decisions that imply sacrifices by all of us. Slowing growth in the compensation bill and additional revenue measures will be needed. The consequence of not acting now would be grave for South Africa. Over time, the country would likely face mounting debt service costs and higher interest rates and may enter a debt trap. The unemployment crisis would worsen and government debt could balloon. This is an outcome we all are determined to avoid. Additional measures will be announced in the 2020 budget. I say this, Mr. President, deliberately because we need to understand that this medium-term budget statement does not propose tax policy changes. But in February, we'll deal with the tax policy changes in order to allow us to balance our books much better. Over the medium term, consolidated government spending totals 6.3 trillion as things stand. That is ceteris paribus. Our priorities are education, social development, and health. These receive 3 trillion over the next 3 years. Approximately half of non-interest spending goes to national government and the other half to provinces and municipalities. We have achieved many social gains over the past 25 years. Our social spending programs can be sustained over the long term, provided we make reasonable and prudent choices. On our current trajectory, by the end of the 3-year framework, debt service costs will be bigger than spending on health and economic development. Our problem is that we spend more than we earn. It is as simple as that. How will we fix it? Because we are a leadership, we are not a complaining society. To stabilize debt, government will target a primary balance by 2022-23. Primary balance means that your revenue and expenditure, that must give you a number of 0%. Now I'm helping you because I can see you're struggling. The target measure excludes support to ESCOM because that is part of a separate process. As a first step, we have identified spending reductions of 21 billion rand in 2020-21, 29 billion rand in 21-22, mostly, unfortunately, in the area of goods and services and transfers. In addition, non-interest spending in the outer years of the framework is constrained in line with the consumer price inflation. That said, if we want to achieve our target, we'll need to find additional measures in excess of 150 billion rand over the next 3 years, or about 50 billion rand a year. How will we do this? We'll need to deal with the challenges of the wage bill, state-owned companies, executive remuneration and benefits, and fiscal leakages. In the review accompanying this statement, we set out a detailed analysis of spending on public sector wages. It shows that, it's an interesting figure actually, it shows that 29,000 public servants, plus members of the National Executive, members of Parliament, members of the provincial executives and so forth, each earned more than 1 million rand last year. So they become millionaires. This is more than double the number of civil servants earning more than 1 million rand in 2006-07. So when members of the DA shout up and down, you must know that it's because they are concerned about their status. The average wage increases across government was 6.8% in 2018-19, or 2.2% in above inflation. After adjusting for inflation, the average government wage has risen by 66% in the last 10 years. We look forward to robust discussions in the relevant bargaining structures and with other stakeholders to achieve a sustainable solution. We are all in this together. In the same breath, we would like to send a message to state-owned companies, public entities, and the private sector, the boards of directors and executive management on compensation and benefits, which must be managed downwards. The President has issued a directive which will apply to members of Cabinet and members of the provincial executives as follows. Firstly, for the foreseeable future, Cabinet, Premiers, MEC salaries will be frozen at current levels, with the likelihood of further negotiations. 2, the cost of official cars at national, provincial, and local level will be kept at 800,000 VAT inclusive. 3, a new cell phone dispensation will cap the amount claimable from the state. 4, all domestic travel will be on economy class. 5, the Minister of Finance will make a determination on the appropriate use of subsistence and travel for all arms of the state. I encourage, listen carefully, Mr. Deputy Speaker, listen carefully. I encourage the leadership of Parliament to think about applying the same rules. In the 2019 budget, some measures were announced. This included, 1, a program to ease the wage bill. 2, the national macro reorganization of government. 3, reducing performance bonuses, freezing salaries for members of the executive and parliamentarians, amongst others. Unfortunately, these have not been fully realized as savings. The early retirement program has only yielded so far about 4,000 volunteers. We will need to reinvigorate this process. We must also wean state-owned companies off the national budget. They must learn to stand on their own feet. Government has announced a comprehensive set of structural reforms for Eskom, as announced by my colleague, Minister Gordon, and also reforms in the energy sector, which we are supporting with 230 billion rand over the next 10 years. Very difficult budget adjustments have been made. To meet unanticipated cash needs, we have brought forward 26 billion rand in 2019-20, 33 billion rand in 2020-21, and 10 billion rand in 21-22. Further delays in operational reforms could mean additional demands on an already strained fiscus. We cannot continue to throw money at Eskom, I think everybody agrees. For the sizable support required, it cannot obviously be business as usual. In our view, Honorable Deputy Speaker, Eskom must do the following. 1, run their current plant and equipment better. 2, achieve other operational efficiencies, including better cash management. 3, fast-track the separation of the utility into the 3 parts as endorsed by the political principles. There should be no doubt about these policy decisions. We have come this far and we have to complete the race. The Minister of Public Enterprises has elaborated on this, when he presented the ESCOM paper yesterday. Going forward, suppose this is probably the most important announcement of this speech. Going forward, new cash flow support will no longer be based on equity, but will be in the form of loans. Going forward, any form of support to state-owned enterprises will no longer be in the form of equity, but loans. And a loan needs to be repaid with interest. Once I'm convinced that the ESCOM board and management have made an irrevocable commitment to the implementation of the government decisions and that there is enough progress, we'll negotiate the appropriate size of debt relief. ESCOM is a business and it should be run like a business. Now, SAA is unlikely to ever generate enough cash flow to sustain operations in its current configuration, which then begs the question, how long are we going to be on this flight path? I think we can fix things, and we have the capability and capacity to do that. Operational and governance interventions are required urgently. I am pleased, honorable members, to learn that there are conversations involving SAA and potential equity partners, which will liberate the fiscus from this SAA sword of Damocles. We have essentially chosen to subsidize the middle class and wealthy to fly around the country and other parts of the world, rather than subsidize ordinary workers who sit in old trains from the townships every day, often getting stuck in the train and arriving late for work. I think there's an honorable member who got stuck in the train here, I won't mention. We are also subsidizing the wealthy bond holders who hold government-guaranteed debt but receive higher yields without additional risk. That's when we borrow to finance our activities. Cabinet has considered several options to resolve the impasse over the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project. The reconfigured approach to the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project and its financing will be determined by the Ministers of Finance and Transport after consultations with the Premier of Gauteng and the Executive Council. Further details will be provided by the Minister of Transport. But, honorable members, not paying your tolls is not an option. We therefore have to ensure that we honor our obligations. I urge the nation to pay for bills for services rendered. We need to build a culture of payment, as government services can only be sustained if we all pay what is due. Now, Deputy Speaker, other state-owned companies that require support from the fiscus will be subject to certain preconditions. One, government as a shareholder commits to the highest standards of corporate governance. Two, managers and their teams should not receive bonuses or salary increases when they fail to meet basic financial targets and service objectives. In fact, Deputy Chair, they should take a pay cut and in some cases be relieved of their duties. Three, and finally, business with outdated business models are a major fiscal risk and should be closed. It is critical to drive further infrastructure investment, Public sector infrastructure projects are plagued by poor planning and implementation. This comes out in underspending, which reached 20% of capital budgets last year. The Budget Facility for Infrastructure, a technical entity that reviews complex capital projects, has already strengthened its own capacity. In addition, government has made progress on a blended finance infrastructure model, which is what the President has been speaking about for a while. The fund will be hosted by the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and it will be led by an actual living human being, Dr. Sean Phillips. The implementation team for the fund is already at work. They have already identified policy and regulatory hurdles. A pipeline of possible projects amounting to more than 500 billion has been identified. Government has set aside 100 billion rand over the coming decade to finance projects and programs from this baseline number of 10 billion rand. Pilot projects receive 500 million in the current year. We're working with the private sector to fund this process. And I can report, Mr. President, that substantive conversations have already taken place with private banks and other institutions so that they can come to the party, and they are ready and willing to come to the party. We're making progress on improving the efficiency of the state. The state can use its budget much better. For example, and this is a good example, Mr. President, I was saying that the state can use its resources much better. For an example, the South African National Defence Force buys more than 900 million rand worth of food a year. So, in these difficult circumstances, the Chief of the Defence Force has informed me that they have started Operation Kuba Tlala, Operation Chase Away Hunger, which is a deliberate effort by our armed forces to buy food from nearby suppliers. As you know, the Defence Force has many bases around the country. So if they source their food from local suppliers, that just makes things much better. It removes the middle person and brings down the prices of these goods. Where possible, given budgetary constraints, we should encourage the whole government and parastatal system to do like the National Defence Force. Through reprioritization, the National Prosecuting Authority receives an additional 1.3 billion rand. This is important so that they can get the work of getting the criminals in jail. And the South African Revenue Service receives an additional 1 billion rand so that they can collect as much revenue as possible. These funding shifts will bolster efforts to combat corruption and improve revenue collection. Let me also say, Mr.
Point of order. What's the point of
My
order?
humble apologies, Minister. Deputy Speaker, there's someone taking a video from the ANC benches there.
No.
With the flashlight taking a video and pictures there.
Honorable member, if you are doing that, you are out of order and you know it.
It is a member with the blue there. At the back, second row from the back.
And the whips will attend to that, please. We want to know who that is so that we act on them. Honorable Minister, please proceed.
I was interested in the mention of the color blue. Anyway, earlier this month, Cabinet approved that over 14,000 hectares of land will be released for human settlements development. The National Treasury has reviewed the procurement framework and has developed a public procurement bill, which will be considered by Cabinet very soon. The very simple issue about procurement in the government system is that we pay higher prices when we should not be. So therefore, we have to attend to this, Mr. President. It straddles from this notion of 3 codes, and then you appoint the lowest code. It applies to all kinds of bureaucratic mismatches, which lead us losing a lot of time and a lot of money. So we're reviewing all of this. I've listened carefully to colleagues who have made inputs about the rigidities in the Public Finance Management Act, but also listened carefully to Salga about the impact of the Municipal Finance Management Act. I've listened carefully to that, and we're going to be reviewing it. We're going to ask an independent judge to look at all these laws and see what to do with them, likely to be Judge Davis. South Africa rejoined the Community of Nations in 1994 and has played its part in advancing the peaceful international order. In these physically constrained times, we need to relook at the strategic value of all our international commitments without moving away from internationalism. The National Health Insurance Policy aims to provide health care to many South Africans. It is an urgent task that we are pursuing. There are ongoing conversations between the Ministers of Finance and Health, and also between our respective departments. Parliament is also seized with the NHI bill. We will take stronger measures to fight illegitimate cross-border flows and tax evasion. Our approach to money laundering will be reviewed by the Financial Action Task Force. Steps are also being taken to strengthen cooperation between the Financial Intelligence Center, the FIC, the South African Revenue Service, and the South African Reserve Bank. To promote investment and reduce unnecessary burdensome approvals, by budget day next year, the South African Reserve Bank will have proposed a more modern, transparent, and risk-based approvals framework for cross-border flows. Rules on active currency hedging, loops, and mortgages for individuals living and working in South Africa will be reformed. To support regional integration, the holdco, the holding company regime, will be extended to all banks in the Republic. Mr. Deputy Chair, the South African Reserve Bank has, during a very difficult period, kept inflation stable. They have declared a substantial increased profit share to the government. The bank is a very strange creature of statute. Even though we do not own it, the National Revenue Fund receives 90% of the profits from the South African Reserve Bank after the bank has made provisions for ordinary items usually made by bankers. Last financial year, we received a profit share from the South African Reserve Bank of some 200 million rand. It is a very beautiful arrangement, Mr. President. We do not have to invest any money into the bank, but we get almost all the profits plus taxation. Madam Mr. Deputy Chair, that is my presentation today. Government proposes measures to grow the economy. In addition, we are committed to narrowing the deficit, raising the quality of spending, particularly on large infrastructure projects. As we do this, we trust that we have the support of the entire House. And the less politicized the budget policy statement is, the better for South Africa. I end my remarks as I began this presentation. The winter has been long, but we must prepare for spring and reposition the Republic to grow and to thrive. We need to plant good seeds for our country, both now and for the future. Honorable President, in June this year, you addressed this august House and made clear that the policy of our government is, I quote, prudent borrowing and stringent expenditure management to stabilize our public finances and lower the debt trajectory, unquote. That is the work that we must now do. That is what the South African public expect from us. We shall return to this House next February with the nation's beloved aloe ferox having flourished and show a government at work. As I conclude, Mr. President, without breaching the laws of protocol, may I wish the mighty Springboks all the best this weekend, and I think they will success. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Honorable members, I thank the Honorable Minister. The papers he tabled will be referred to relevant committees. That concludes the business of the day. The House is adjourned.
all of us are in it. We either swim together or sink together.
Plans on fighting corruption?
Yes, I think that, of course, that is one of the major problems we have, the corruption that we have. The problem is mismanagement. Clearly, we are all celebrating our freedom, but it's quite clear that we have not managed our country as we should. And in fact, I don't see why we should have been so, relaxed about the state-owned enterprises. Because I heard even today from the chairperson of Scopa that even the Express airline is going to be bailed out with 300 billion today. It's amazing that while the minister has stated clearly that we are spending more money than we're spending money we don't have, but we still have money to bail out. I mean, it's a contradiction.
All right, thank you so much, Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. The Emeritus President of the IFP will now link back to Arabile in studio.
Bulelani, thank you so much for that. Yeah, I am joined in studio now by Colin Coleman, the Chief Executive Officer of Goldman Sachs South Africa. Colin, thank you so much for the time. Does this garner some, perhaps some helpful interest from the investment community, do you reckon? Did this MTBPS reassure you?
Well, what will stand out is a powerful warning that the Minister of Finance gave to Parliament and to South Africa as a whole, that unless the rising costs of government are brought down relative to the income that it's getting through the tax system, that we are going to get into an unsustainable set of fiscal ratios. And so we have to get expenditure under control and we have to get growth going. And without both happening, South Africa faces the potential situation that he called a debt trap into the future. So we have to take this warning that he's issued very seriously, and as a country and as a government, work out very detailed mechanics of bringing expenditure under control and getting growth going.
Yeah, he did make note of how much he plans to support Eskom with over the next 10 years or so, plus minus around 230 billion rand odd. And those are just continued support measures for it. But it needs to start functioning on its own. How clear, how important and how decisive was a message like that as well? And did it perhaps send the right message as well to the investment community that we are serious about making sure that Eskom stands on its own 2 feet?
Well, the questions from the investment community will be, this is a second or a third in a series of warnings about the state-owned enterprises from Minister Mboweni to his counterpart, Minister Gordon, about the drain that the state-owned enterprises represent on the fiscus. And we've seen, I would say, limited action insofar as stopping the bleeding of the impact of state-owned enterprises on the fiscus in the real economy. So I think there are attempts by President Ramaphosa and his team to bring the state-owned enterprises into the right zone. But we haven't yet seen the practical benefits of that. And so hopefully this is kind of near the bottom, and we need to see the wheels start to turn for the better.
Finally, very last thing, what do you feel may have been missing from this medium-term budget policy statement?
That's difficult to say, there's because we haven't had time to study the documents, but the speech itself was a very high level, as I say, warning shot. There wasn't a clear set of specifics about how they are going to bring these expenditures down, but he did identify the themes, SOEs, public wages, and others, where the target is going to be focused.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably sufficient for now.
Sure.
We will want to see the detail in order to evaluate it.
Colin, appreciate the time. Thank you so much for that. Colin Coleman there from Goldman Sachs South Africa, Chief Executive Officer then of Goldman Sachs Sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you so much for that. We'll cross back then to my colleague Bulelani Philip on the steps of Parliament, and hopefully right after that we'll be joined then by the Deputy Minister of Finance as we get to unpack that MTBPS further. Bulelani.
Well, thanks so much. Once again, Arabile will continue to take the reactions. We now bring in the PAC, the leader of the PAC, Mr. Mzwanele Nyonso. For the poor, is there anything that they can take out of this mini budget?
Really nothing. There is nothing new. There is nothing for the poor. And of the most concern is the unbundling of Eskom, which is anyway privatization. And Eskom must remain a state enterprise. And I don't know why is it difficult for these guys to allow consumers to buy electricity directly from Eskom instead of buying it via municipalities. Anyway, the municipalities are the reasons why Eskom is always asking for bailouts, because they don't pay the debts. So that's the problem. So poor will always suffer.
If there's only one economic reform that you would have liked to see, what would it be?
It would be an economy that is pro-poor, an economy where the state is in charge of all state enterprises, not the private investors. Remember, if you privatize, the business people are going to look for profit, maximum profit. And if it is under the state, then it is going to be better for the poor to access these things. So if the state is not nationalizing the strategic aspects of the economy, the poor will remain poor and nothing will change.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Mzwanele Nyonso from the PAC. I'm now going to bring a voice of the workers from COSATU. Matthew Parks, who is the parliamentary councillor for COSATU. Matthew, again, the thorny issue of the wage bill and it being cut down. The minister making some strides and saying that that needs to come down. Your thoughts?
Look, as COSATU, we reject any attack upon workers. He's basically blaming nurses and teachers, police officers who earn very little money, 200,000 rand, for the wage bill. We can't blame people who want to take care of the family. He must rather look at the 10% of the budget that we lose every year to corruption. That's 150 billion rand, to wasteful expenditure. He's not touched upon the departments which have failed to spend the budgets that we saw today. He's not even touching upon the fact that a third of the wage bill is actually from management, from ministers, from executive directors, from the DGs. He's not proposing any cuts there. Yet he wants to blame nurses who want to take care of the families. So for us, it's a huge problem. He should also rather look at tax evasion, people who don't pay their taxes, the wealthy in particular, and deal with the issues of corruption in Eskom. We're not arresting those who have stolen, yet we want to go after nurses and teachers who earn a small amount of money. So for us, the minister's not being honest. He's being disingenuous, and we'll deal with him at the Public Service Bargaining Council if he comes there.
All right, thank you so much. Matthew Parks is the parliamentary councillor for COSATU. In this conversation, I'm going to bring in now the leader of the Congress of the People, Ndate Musiwalekota. Basically, the minister laying out a lot of economic reforming strategies. Do you think it will take us in the right direction?
Well, certainly he's begun to touch on the nerve centers that need to be touched on. He will, of course, in 3 months' time, he will then propose firm steps that must be taken. We must recognize the fact that we cannot continue to emphasize consumption, paying a lot of money to large numbers of South Africans, but who are not in productive industries. You need people to be employed to work the land. You need people to be in all of these productive industries so that we can export things, etc., etc. And so that you can attract not only South African investors, but also investors from abroad. Now, as long as we threaten to take people's properties, we are making it impossible for investors to invest and employ all these unemployed people. Once the people are employed, they will then pay their tolls. They will then be able to spend the money that they earn because they are here. If you don't do that, you're letting them sit on the side of the street, and then they cannot pay the tolls. Then they cannot spend the money because you are not paying them. And then what you are doing, you are grinding the economy to a dead still. When he begins to say, we will no longer give you bailouts, you must borrow the money and invest it productively so that you can pay your debts and so on. Now that is the right step to go in. Instead of keep giving free money, give free money, and then it's finished, then they come back for more money and so on. The purpose for state-owned enterprises is so that they make profits and contribute to the fiscals. If they are no longer making profits, close them down.
All right, Mr. Musiwalekota, leader of the Congress of the People, giving us his views and what they expected from this mini budget. For now, we'll cross back to you, Arabile, and we'll take more reaction when you're done.
Thank you, Bulelani Philip, there, of course, on the steps of Parliament. I am joined in our studio now by the Deputy Finance Minister, that's Mr. David Masondo, then joining us here. Thank you so much for the time. Really, really appreciate it, Buff. You've heard some of the sentiments and the comments then coming through from the steps of Parliament, the likes of Musiwa Lekota, Kosatu as well, really feeling that the Minister has been a bit disingenuous. Perhaps your thoughts and your comments on that?
I think it's important to start by saying that we presented this budget at MTBPS within a very tight financial constraints. Notwithstanding that, we're still committed to providing financing, education, health, social grants, as well as its infrastructure. However, we're concerned about three rising expenditure items: wage bill, SOEs, and the debt service cost, the interest that we're paying to the debt that we owe. And insofar as the wage bill is concerned, the Minister has laid it out there that we'll be engaging with all the people who get income in the form of salary, wages, bonuses across the state to start to have a conversation on how we can cut that. It's not just nurses, all of us who get income from the state. We need to seriously have a conversation on how we can moderate the increase insofar as salaries and wage bills are concerned. It was very clear that insofar as the SOEs, we cannot, because many of them we know that they cannot meet their financial obligations. Sure. However, entities such as ESCOM, the problem is not money. You can recapitalize, you can bail out ESCOM year in, year out, but as long as you will not deal with the cost drivers, the revenue will not be able to deal with the problem. Minister Gordon, yesterday, he presented a paper which attempts to deal with both the cost drivers of ESCOM as well as revenue. Because throwing money into the problem is not sustainable. And it's for that reason that we also said that we can no longer continue to give equity injection to these SOEs. We've got to make sure that we give them loans. And we'll also go through all of them, all the state entities, not just at the national level, but also at the local and the provincial level, and ask one question only. It's your state-owned entity, growth enhancing, or is draining the fiscus? And if it's draining the fiscus, we've got to close it down.
Sure. Are you in support, though, of the plan that the Minister of Public Enterprises has put forward yesterday? Is National Treasury in support of that plan, and then saying that they will back the plan in whatever possible way within, of course, the confines of the fiscus?
Oh, of course. We developed the plan together with them. National Treasury, as well as the Department of Public Enterprise, there have been a lot of consultations and conversations with them on ESCOM paper. And I think we are also happy that they will also be sorting out the governance issues.
Sure.
We've been advised that very soon they'll be announcing the appointment of a CEO for ESCOM.
Yeah. Minister, Deputy Minister, I'm going to ask if you could please stay with us and perhaps hear the words then, and perhaps some thoughts from the EFF as well, from the steps of Parliament. My colleague Bulelani Philip is standing by with them.
Right, thanks once again, Arabile. In this conversation, I'm bringing in the Chief Whip of the EFF, Mr. Floyd Shibambu. You came in here with a lot of proposals in terms of how to turn the economy around. In your view, has the Minister delivered?
No, he has not said anything that is new and is cogent in terms of what we should do to turn around the economy in South Africa. You know, we have got a huge crisis in South Africa of poverty, of inequalities, but of even deeper crisis of unemployment, of rising unemployment. And the rising unemployment comes out of the declining jobs in the manufacturing sector. There is no economy anywhere in the world that sustains growth and becomes much more dependable in terms of job creation without focusing on industrialization, and in particular in the manufacturing sector. So there's nothing that is believable that was said by the Minister in relation to industrial and trade policy in terms of how are we going to, one, stop the jobs that are being lost now from being lost further, but also to create more jobs in the manufacturing and industrial space. And that is the failure of everything else. You can't build an economy based on cosmetic austerity measures that he announced today there. an economy is built through industry. That is the only way to build an economy. And the Minister of Finance never spoke anything about that. So there is this excitement about macroeconomics or fiscal policy and monetary policy, but there is no clearer focus on the microeconomics of how do you drive industry, how do you support small and medium enterprises so that they are the core of economic activity in South Africa. How do you strategically substitute some of the imports that are coming into South African economy and domestically build a manufacturing capacity that is going to make sure that as many people as possible are employed, that is going to broaden your revenue base. The Minister of Finance never spoke about any of those aspects. So as the EFF were not inspired or not even convinced about what he said today, he was not inspired at all.
Before I let you go, a pronouncement of R1 billion for SARS to fight illicit financial flows?
Look, there's been lots of nominal commitments and made around the fight against illicit financial flows, tax base erosion and profit shifting. And our insistence is that you have to enact a legislation first that forbids tax avoidance, that forbids profit shifting. But now we do not have a proper legislative framework in the South African Parliament and in South Africa that deals with those aspects. That is why, as part of the interventions in the sixth Parliament, we are going to reintroduce the anti-tax avoidance bill as the EFF, which must be turned into an act of Parliament. And in that way, we can guarantee South Africa that we'll create an additional 100 billion rand in revenue so that we can be able to make interventions in social services, in education, in healthcare and social development in general. But currently there is no proper foundation legislatively to fight illicit financial flows because the ANC government has been negligent in the manner in which it deals with this issue. And it is doing so because it is their friends who are involved in illicit financial flows and tax-based erosion. So they close one eye deliberately because they do not want to tempt out the profits of their friends in the capitalist establishment.
All right, Mr. Floyd Chibambu, the Chief Whip of the EFF, giving us this party's views. For now, Arabile, we'll cross back to you, studio.
Bulelani, thank you so much for that. Of course, as I said a little bit earlier, still joined by the Deputy Finance Minister, David Masondo. Mr. Masondo, you've heard the sentiments of the EFF's Floyd Chibambu. Your thoughts, perhaps?
I think the Minister, or what he presented today, we made it very clear that if we can't grow this economy, it's going to be very difficult for us to raise revenue. It's going to be very difficult to generate employment. And we've released a discussion document on economic strategy. And amongst other things that we're saying in that document, there's a pillar which we call reimagined industrial strategy, which is aimed at making sure that we support and rebuild the manufacturing sector, to make sure that the manufacturing sector's contribution to the GDP grows significantly. Because 1994, the manufacturing sector's contribution to GDP was 24%. It has significantly gone down now to 12%, 13%. And we're saying that it's important for us to focus in that area. And there are detailed plans. And we've done a lot insofar as the certain industry, like the automotive industry, and making sure that we increase the local content. And secondly, many of the procurement, the kind of procurement that we do, we emphasize that there must be localization, e.g. procurement of buses, procurement of rail stock for Transnet, PRASA. We've been pushing very hard that there has to be local content. Secondly, we've said for us to grow this economy, it's important to break the barriers to entry for SMMEs. Barriers to entry ranging from skills, finance, infrastructure. And in breaking the barriers to entry for SMMEs to get in, it's not a question of doing away with big business or big companies. It's about the articulation between the two.
Yeah.
Where does a big company source some of its services, goods from? They must source them from the local. And the third point is that in the document that we've released, which is receiving a lot of support, we've said that it's important for us to look at infrastructure, what we've termed network industries, telecommunication, electricity, water, which the minister has articulated in this MTBPS statement.
Very finally, I have to ask Mr. Masondo, do you think this was enough to stave off a downgrade, even if it is to our credit outlook? Of course, Moody's does come out with their sentiments and their rating on South Africa on Friday.
We've done our best to really put our policy positions on this, and secondly, to demonstrate that we do have institutions that work, the institutions that are very conducive for attracting and retaining and attracting new investment. Next week, we'll also be showing case the kind of conducive environment that we have in South Africa to increase the investment rates.
Are you in discussion with the ratings agencies today by any chance, or within the next few hours?
Our teams are in conversation with them, and we've been in conversation with them. They've raised concern, and some of the concern that they've raised, we've tried our best to basically deal with them. The wage bill, issues around ESCOM, and the rise of our debt. We've really tried our best to basically incorporate many of the concerns that they have.
Mr. Masondo, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us here on SABC News. The Deputy Finance Minister then as well, joining us right here in studio in Parliament, of course, right after the Finance Minister delivered that medium-term budget policy statement 2019. Let's head back then to the steps of Parliament. My colleague Bulelani Philip still there with some reaction.
Well, thanks, Arabile. We're still taking a wide range of reactions, both politically and civil society. For the moment being, I'm going to be speaking to the president of the political party, Al Jamaa, which has one seat in the National Assembly, Mr. Muhammad Hendricks. Basically, this mini budget for you, does it bring investor and business confidence in order to create jobs?
No, I don't think so, because the big problem is that South Africa is broke at the moment, and that our spending patterns will soon exceed the revenue that is generated in the country, and that will not give investors the necessary confidence. At the same time, what is very worrying is that the Minister of Finance did not put the trade unions on terms that when it comes to February, there may be no increases for them, because the country can't afford to increase the public salary bill. Also, the Minister of Finance has appointed the women of South Africa. They were looking forward to listening how the 1 billion rand to combat violence against women will be consolidated, because at the moment the 1 billion is spread amongst 20 different government departments, and one would have expected that it will be consolidated into one line item. The investors are obviously looking at the screams of women that violence against women needs to be addressed, and I don't think that they would want to invest in such an environment. Also, one of the president talked about the district models, where the 3 tiers of government, that the budgets that they have will be consolidated in the districts, and one would then have a lot of economic opportunities in these districts, but the Minister of Finance did not prepare the country that something is going to be done about that come February.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. We've got a couple of people to get through. Mr. Muhammad Hendricks, thank you so much for your time. He is, of course, the leader of the Al Jamaa. I'm going to bring into conversation now a spokesperson of the ruling party, Mr. Dakota Lechwete, who has been standing by. Mr. Lechwete, thank you so much for joining us. The policy reforms announced by the finance minister, do you think they will take us out of this economic crisis that we face?
Yes, indeed. As the African National Congress, we welcome the statement by the minister. It is consistent with what we have resolved as a movement, that as part of the turnaround strategy on our economic challenges, one of the things that has been identified as a problem, it was the ESCOM, energy security and energy supply. And so far we are happy that it will go out to have 3 subsidiaries, but the ownership of that particular entity still remains with the state, which is very good. What would be getting its private-public partnerships, and build operator transfer in the form of equities, which can be from the public, which can be from direct foreign investments, and some of them is what we are looking at, because the major thing that is very important is to have energy security, because for our economy to contract and do bad in the past, where we lost minus 3.2%, was highly through the energy security.
But the question though is Eskom going to be privatized from the ANC's point of view?
No, we have not agreed on privatization. What we have agreed is that we'll have 3 subsidiaries, with one which is transmission being wholly 100% owned by the state, and the other 2 getting equity partners. So that's what we are looking at. And obviously we don't want privatization for the sake of privatization, because you can't have an institution and a company like Eskom, which was working effectively, all of a sudden having challenges, and the quickest decision we have to make is to privatize in a country where more than 10 million people are unemployed, where more than 17 million people are living on grants. It's not quite fair and consistent. But we're also happy that government is committed to build and put up more spending on infrastructure development. I think for just this financial year, they're putting aside over 500 billion rand. I think that's enough amount of money to kickstart and resuscitate the project of turning around the economy and ensuring that we are on a growth path again. They are putting aside certain amount on tourism and other related infrastructure issues, including 1.1 billion rand on SARS, 1.3 billion rand on NPA, as part of our efforts to show that we do not pay a lip service to the fight against corruption and state of capture, but we are putting up efforts, including finances and resources. And that particular money of 1.3 billion, it will also assist us on fighting gender-based violence. Because that particular scale.
Before I let you go, I do want to touch on the issue of the relations between the ruling party as well as the alliance partners, particularly around the pronouncements of this economic transformation paper presented by National Treasury, as well as the pronouncements of reducing the wage bill of government.
Look, you would understand, we are living in a free market economy. We are living in a global world economy. That's why countries like China, they did not solely rely on socialism and communism. They brought in something called socialism with Chinese characteristics as part of the reform and the restructuring processes, but not running away from creating a middle class, not running away from defeating poverty. By 2020, there will be no poverty in China. And today, out of 1.4 billion Chinese citizens, 520 million of them are millionaires. We can work out from such models without hating capital, because we need capital to resuscitate our economy. We need capital to ensure that our kids have a future. We need capital to ensure that we build infrastructure and other related issues. And it's for all of us in the Alliance and the ANC to smell the coffee and wake up, because we can't rely on old methods which would not be implementable today. Even though we don't run away from the ideological base, we need to deal with the current challenges.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Takota Legwete. He is, of course, the spokesperson of the African National Congress. On that note, for now, Arabile, I'm going to throw it back to you in studio.
Bulelani, thank you so much for that. I am joined this time around as well by Elna Mulman, economist then at Standard Bank, and she joins us for some reaction as well. Elna, thank you so much for the time. Your thoughts? I mean, did it cover everything? Yes, there was a large section on Eskom, but did it actually put any lights on for you?
I think, unfortunately, this is one of those times when it's basically just saying to us, if we don't take steps from here, then the outcomes will be ABC. So if we look at the debt trajectory, for example, it's an absolutely shocking picture. But now the difficulty is in saying we'll only get there if we don't take action. And the question is, how much action will we actually take? So unfortunately, this still kind of leaves us in limbo. We were all hoping that after this week we would know.
Exactly, but that's what I was saying. Yeah. That perhaps it gives them so much leeway to perhaps just act within whatever ambit they have and hope for the best at the end of that. Does this perhaps hold them accountable in any way? I certainly don't think so.
Yeah. So I think what this is basically just Treasury's way of giving government the ammunition to say we can no longer delay some of the tough decisions. You've mentioned Eskom, and that's one part. And I do think on Eskom, we're at least starting to make progress, right? So we've had the release of that paper this week. And from a market perspective, we may look at that and say you don't do enough to address the immediate liquidity issues, etc. But at the same time, I think what they're trying to do is the right things from a longer term perspective. So on Eskom's side, I think they're steadily making progress. The question is more on the fiscal side, whether government will actually be able to implement. Treasury vaguely refers to about 150 billion rands worth of interventions. That's a lot. And if you look at the composition and the things that they referred to, it's kind of wage bill and sale of non-core assets. And these are difficult decisions to make.
Debt to most likely exceed 70% of GDP by 2022-2023. When we were shocked not so long ago, and I think Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba stood here at the MTBPS that year and raised the picture to around 64-65%, we were absolutely shocked. 70% comes out, oh, kind of expected.
I think this was worse than anybody expected, and I still hope that when we get to the budget next year, they will actually improve the picture. In other words, they will take some of the steps. The problem is that they probably won't be able to take all of the steps that they think is necessary. And sometimes the 70% sounds a little bit abstract, but I think the way to look at this is to say we're now spending more on debt servicing costs than on total social grants. So clearly there's something wrong with this picture.
Where do we fix the disconnect, though? I mean, and I say that because, yes, we've been given this MTBPS, which is supposed to aid the resolution of some of South Africa's problems at present and perhaps into the future. And yes, fine, it doesn't have major tax pronouncements, but what it should have is a formulaic pathway. And perhaps some might get lost in the mire of where exactly we stand. We say we no longer can accept certain things, but we haven't said what we are going to do to ensure that they don't happen anymore.
Yes. I think to some extent Treasury is just saying, you know, we can do the calculations and we can do the funding for you, etc. But the difficult decisions around government wage bill that needs to be managed, for example, that needs to be negotiated elsewhere, and they can only deal with the consequences. I have to say they have done reasonably well on the expenditure side to contain general costs. They've cut the spending on general goods and services, etc. So I think there we have to give Treasury a little bit of credit. But unfortunately the big decisions still have to be made, and they're not made by Treasury, and there's not much time left before the budget to make these decisions.
There really, really isn't. 150 billion in terms of savings over the next 3 years. Where do you find 50 billion to cut off over the next 3 years if you already have, for example, made sure that salaries of cabinet officials, MECs and the likes are stagnant and moving backwards, stipends, cell phones, cars, all of those costs already within this fiscal are just kept under wraps, if not going backwards, hopefully. Where then will you find an extra 50 billion every year over the next 3 years?
I think it would still, a major element of that would have to come from the general government wage bill. And so, for example, if we look at, over the last, let's say, 10 years, then the increases in the government wage bill was well ahead of the private sector. So the private sector, you can get away with excessive increases one year or two, but not for a sustained period. And we have now started seeing this disconnect, and it would simply have to be addressed. Unfortunately, in this year's budget, government proposed early retirement packages, and the hope was that that would be taken up, and we haven't seen that. So basically what we've said is that promise now carries over, and we have to negotiate around that. Plus now we have a much bigger negotiation to make as well. But I think ultimately it's just going to say we have spent beyond our means for quite some time, immediately after the global financial crisis, and everybody is now going to feel some pain. So we focused quite a bit in our discussion on the government wage bill that needs to be addressed. But tax increases, I think, is also unfortunately going to be inevitable. There's already 10 billion coming.
Where?
I think unfortunately a big part of it is still going to be on the consumer side. So I think fiscal drag will definitely be there, and it will be meaningful. So that just means that the tax brackets are not adjusted in line with inflation. So actually then it starts eating into your real disposable income. So that, I think, is going to happen. And we're already seeing that consumers are under significant pressure, and debt arrears are rising, etc. So I think we'll see a little bit more of that next year.
Well, unlike the sun out here in Cape Town, you've painted an even more bleak picture. But Elna, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. Elna Moolman, economist at Standard Bank, then joining us here in studio as we get some more of how exactly budget MTBPS has has sort of looked out, and what exactly the forecast even is, perhaps over the next 2 to 3 years odd as well. Let's cross on over to the steps of Parliament. My colleague Bulelani Phillips getting some reaction as well.
Well, Arabile, we're going to be taking some reaction from the Progressive Professionals Forum just to check around the issues of this exclusive economy. I'm going to bring into the conversation Azania Matiwane, who is from the PPF. The minister's pronouncements is obviously not speaking to numbers and details, but as the PPF, are you hopeful that this kind of strategy that is undertaking will be bringing an inclusive and competitive economy?
Our view is simple. First of all, in 2017, you would know that the shortfall of about 50 billion rands was encountered by under Minister Malusi Gigaba. The very same situation has arisen in this current midterm budget policy statement, which simply says that there's a number of things that have happened. One of them is that there's an increase in unemployment, meaning the revenue base has decreased. And government spending has increased, meaning that government has been spending money that they don't have, and that is why they're borrowing more. So there's a need that we need to look at, first of all, the issue of infrastructural spending, which is a positive thing that government has taken care of it now. But the other thing that is happening is that there is an absence of serious looking at cutting the fat around the issue of spending on public service, more especially around the issue of compensation. So we are hopeful that maybe in February we are going to be opening our eyes and looking at what are the policy measures that are going to be proposed so that to cut the issue of the fat, because so far there's not been real actions and policy decisions towards cutting the fat around the issue of spending in public services.
This issue of the wage bill keep coming up around the issue of creating acrimonious relations between government as the employer as well as labor. I mean, it leads to prolonged strikes, which also in turn affects the economy. How do we get out of that conundrum?
Look, we must bear in mind, those who are employed are that far, they're just the minority of those that are unemployed. We need to look at how do we get those that are unemployed to be able to get into the tax revenue-based system. And if we cannot be able to do that, that simply means that we need to take some serious political decisions. And the ruling party needs to take this thing very serious, whereby we need to look at what serious political decisions we can be able to take so that we can employ more people, so that they can be able to get into contributing tax-wise. At the moment, there's fewer people sustaining the majority, and that's unsustainable. And so that is a hard decision that the ruling party will have to look at, and the decision that they will have to take, and that is a policy decision.
Lastly, before I let you go, the issue of the infrastructure fund, there's talk of a 500 billion pipeline investments. Are you guys involved in any of those?
At the moment, no, we're not. But we believe that government should spend its way out of the current financial situation. And they can only do that if they can be able to spend on capital-intensive markets like your farming and all those things. But also the other thing that we need to do is to spend on infrastructure, improve our infrastructure, employ more people so that we can be able to improve the issue of unemployment.
Thank you so much, Azania Matiwane, who is from the Progressive Professionals Forum, wrapping up all the reactions here in front of the steps of the National Assembly. On that note, Arabile, it's back to you in studio.
Bulelani, thank you so much for that, helping us, of course, cover all the reaction we could possibly get on the steps of Parliament after that medium-term budget policy statement then by the Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, having been delivered a little bit earlier on. As we continue to wrap up and close things off, we are then joined here in studio by Christy Viljoen from PwC and Bernard Sachs then from Mazars as they join us here as well. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I suppose I'll get a quick reaction from both of you just with regards to that speech. Christy, happy? Unhappy?
Happy with some parts, but we're always happy with some parts and unhappy with others.
Yeah.
Some of the numbers look terrible, but I think it's reminding me of the budget statement we had 2 years ago where they did something similar, where they sort of put everything on the table and said, this is how bad it could get if we can't get things sorted out. And so many pages on pages in that document said, wait for Feb, wait for Feb. Yeah. So a few more months and maybe a few more things are sorted out. So I'm just hoping that the next round of numbers can look better from this.
Aren't we tired of that though? Aren't we tired of just getting the notion of, well, let's wait for next one. Let's wait for February to get a clearer picture, more detail. We wanted more detail now. We didn't get the detail. We're going to wait for February again. It's getting a little exhausting.
Oh yes, we're very tired of that. I think because we've been kicking this bucket for so long, that's why this economy is not growing. We're looking at 5-6 years of very low growth. It's because we can't sort these things out. So I'm not enthusiastic about the fact that we're moving away to next year, waiting again and again. At least there is some progress, certainly not enough. In that sense, it's very disappointing. Our economy is not going to be much better off tomorrow than it was today before the speech.
Sure, that's certainly going to be true. Mr. Sachs, your thoughts on that MTBPS?
I agree that there was a lot of honesty about the problem. However, I think there was a lot more that I would like to have heard about what is going to be done to rectify the shortcomings. And I agree as well that there was a lot of deferral to February. And I don't believe that we can afford to wait until February. The time for action is now. And in fact, I would have liked the Minister to have actually reported to us that over the past 4 or 5 months, this is what has been done and these are the results that have been achieved. But all that has happened is he's laid it bare that we're in deep trouble. The economy has contracted, collections are down, the expenditure is up. But all in all, it's quite a bleak picture.
And I mean, we've known all of that, right? We have known that we certainly are in a bleak scenario. Growth of 0.5% for this year, that's not unexpected either, right? But it's not where we should be.
No, that's correct. And for the first 2 quarters, we were up, I think 3.5%. Sorry, I beg your pardon. We were down 3.5% in the first quarter and up 3.5% in the second quarter. So we're flat for the year to date, and they're anticipating the last 2 quarters to deliver growth of a combined 0.5%, and we're projected to growth of I think it's 1.7% in 2022, 2023. If you look at countries slightly north of us, you look at Ghana, you look at Ethiopia, their economies are booming. What is going wrong? We're blessed with natural resources. We're blessed with natural beauty, and I believe we need to be exporting, and we need to be finding ways to beneficiate the minerals that we draw out of the ground rather than exporting the raw minerals or the raw ore.
Yeah. Look, it's easy to be negative also then, Christy, isn't it? And in a time when things are going so bad as, like I said earlier, 70% of GDP, that's just our debt scenario. Our national debt exceeded 3 trillion and is expected to rise to 4.5 trillion over the next 3 years. Consolidated budget deficit, 5.9% of GDP in the current year, rising to around 6.5, 6.6% odd as well. It's easy to be negative. Where are the bright spots, the green shoots that former Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan used to speak about?
Okay, let's think of maybe 2 positive points to mention. The one is, I think there's another line in the sand that Eskom has been given, where they've basically been told, you're not going to get bailouts, you can get loans, but you have to get your house in order. So we need to see evidence that things are turning around there. The other point that I'm actually quite happy with is with the comment on goods and services spending that's going to be declining by an average of 2%. Now, I know the Finance Minister said he wanted about 5. He requested other government departments a few months ago to look at cutting 5-6%. So 2 is at least something. It shows that there is willingness. The big barrier is just the wage bill. So I think there is some enthusiasm within some government departments to help the Finance Minister get things sorted out, and hopefully that builds into a bit more momentum. He's got the backing of the President. As soon as we get more people involved, then we can maybe turn around some of these ugly numbers and then look at a brighter future if we can get that sorted out.
Does it offer a more stern warning to government, to consumers as a whole as well? The fact that they decided to keep, if not reduce, the salaries of cabinet, MEC members, government officials in general, keep cars for officials at around 700k, VAT inclusive as well. All those little measures that they tried to put together. Does that send a stern enough message then that they are trying to curb that wage bill and they are trying to curb government spending a whole lot more?
It's good news, obviously, but it's an easy win, actually. The president can quickly discuss that with cabinet. They agree and they implement it. Now it's in the speech. So that's an easy win. There's also not that much money to be saved. You'll save quite a few million rand, most definitely. But in the bigger picture, it is that more than 1 million state employees that are actually earning relatively high salaries when you compare that to the private sector. And to get those numbers down, I think the finance minister has a big fight on his hands with the labor unions. And then it gets tricky from a political perspective, because labor and government has a very close relationship. So obviously very happy that we're looking at a leaner cabinet that's costing less, but the big challenge is that big public sector payroll.
Yeah, the fight, as he mentioned then, Mr. Sachs, is that it's certainly going to take some while. We spoke to Kusatu a little bit earlier on, and they're saying that you need to stop picking on people like the nurses and the likes of those who aren't earning as much, and instead you should be picking on the kinds of people that are taking home far too much money, in the range of the millions, as they noted in the speech a little bit earlier on. How long will this fight go on for, and how deep could it range for as well?
Well, I think that the minister has demonstrated his resolve to sort that out. But I sensed an element of frustration in the way the minister spoke about the state-owned enterprises and the extent of the rot that is evident there. And I think that as Christy indicated, the concept of a loan rather than a bailout is a good one, and it should hopefully make the senior management at these state-owned enterprises sit up and take note that they will be held accountable, and they will be expected to repay, that there will be interest accruing on those loans, and it will form part of their budgets.
Yeah, fantastic. Gentlemen, thank you so much for the time. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us here on SABC News. That's Bernard Sachs from Mazars, and of course Christy Viljoen then as well from PwC. We'll continue to try and give you as much of a rundown of what exactly happened inside the National Assembly then, as the Finance Minister Tito Mboweni delivered that medium-term budget policy statement. For now, we take a quick break. We'll be back with you right here in Cape Town right after this.
Every year, more and more people all around the country are saving money on their car insurance. Let's meet some of them.
My name is Zanifin, and I'm saving 372 Rand a month with Outsurance. I saw this ad on social media of Outsurance. I replied to it and I got a call almost immediately. I'm a scientist and I had so many difficult questions, but he had all the answers. I saw this amazing saving. I can spend it on what I love doing, which is taking pictures. Switching to Outsurance is a no-brainer.
If you've been with the same insurer for years and haven't recently put Outsurance to the test, SMS SAVE to 34473 or call 08600 60000 for a quote.
My name is Jacques and I save 403 Rand a month with Outsurance. My wife made it happen. I'm a bit of a procrastinator. She nagged me, phone Outsurance, get a better quote. I will definitely take her out for a little something special. As a salesman, seeing how Outsurance does business and the way they treat their customers, I would very much like to take the example and teach that to my salespeople as well.
Don't overpay for car insurance. Put Outsurance to the test today. SMS SAVE to 34473 or call 08600 60000 for a quote.
My name is Yvette and I save 1,250 Rand with Outsurance. I was downstairs and my husband came down and he told me about Outsurance. Then we can pay less than half. I can't believe it, and I just hug him and give him a kiss and I said, that's great. I've got that car 5 months now. It feels like when I'm in that car and while I'm busy driving, I don't want to stop, just want to keep on driving.
They've all saved. Why shouldn't you? SMS SAVE to 34473 or call 08600 60000 for a quote.
My name is Rita and I saved 508 Rand per month with Outsurance. I am a bookkeeper, so I keep a tight rein on my finances. This is going to help me do more of the things that I like to do. Painting, a little bit of wood carving. My car means the world to me. I've had her for 14 years. I feel like $1 million when I'm driving around with it top down. It really makes me feel good.
If you haven't called around for a quote in ages, do it now. SMS SAVE to 34473 or call 08600 60,000 for a quote.
My name is Bakepi. I saved 918 Rand a month without insurance. I couldn't believe the guy. I thought maybe he was just pulling my leg. So I'm a teacher at Karl Malcolm High School in Kokstedt. And the lesson I'm giving to you, if you feel you're paying too much, means you are breathing through the wound, contact insurance.
SMS SAVE to 34473 or call 08600 60,000 for a quote.
Well, welcome back, of course, then to Cape Town here in Parliament, of course, just outside Parliament, where Finance Minister Tito Mboweni delivered his medium-term budget policy statement. We are continuing to get some reaction with regards to that statement and that speech, some sentiments around spending, expenditure, and how well that has been contained, perhaps, and how well he plans to contain that for future purposes. And, of course, Eskom and how that really sits with regards to South Africa's fiscus, a major sticking point, of course, then for the ratings agencies as well. The chief economist then as well from Alexander Forbes, Mr. Azam Mhlanga, joins us here in studio as we get some reaction from him. Thank you so much for the time. Quickly, your thoughts as well. How did it fare for you, if you were perhaps to give it a rating out of 10, number one, and then also just your thoughts on perhaps key poignant issues that stuck out for you?
I think to give it a rating, it's more of what we were expecting, relative to what we got. We're expecting numbers to deteriorate, so we got what we were expecting, but slightly worse than what we were expecting. Obviously, growth expectations just bang on consensus, 0.5%, but if you look at the fiscal deficit, it rises to 6.8%. The debt trajectory goes to 70%. Even if you strip out the impact of Eskom, it still goes above 70% of GDP and it doesn't stabilize. I think that's the major concern, particularly for credit rating agencies. We will likely see that Moody's is going to change the outlook from stable to negative, and that is going to have an impact on markets, perhaps even on the currency, on bond yields. They've already increased 15 basis points as of now, which means it's going to be a lot difficult for South Africans out there.
And you know, you take the dire picture, you take the fact that you say Moody's may certainly change the outlook from stable to negative. It also then just means that we're headed on a downward trajectory and could get downgraded from there on in, and that means June next year, plus minus, you know, at the very latest anyway.
Absolutely. I think what would prevent a credit rating downgrade will be a bold reform process in terms of implementation. But if you read what we got today from the minister, it still blends, and obviously National Treasury is the accounting institution. It doesn't do the actual reform itself. The reforms have to be done by other departments, Department of Mineral Resources, you know, Department of Public Enterprises, as far as state-owned companies is concerned. And I think there is a sense that we're going to get delayed implementation of the Eskom turnaround plan, which means we're going to remain with the fiscal risk, but also with an economic risk in the economy. So if you're a credit rating agency, you look from February, what we were told, things have moved significantly for worse. What would you do? You are tempted to actually change the outlook, to say, guys, I'm giving you a warning, I'm changing the outlook to negative, do the reforms that are required, which you have tabled in the document that was released by the finance minister about a month ago, which contains all the reforms that are required, but it seems it's going to be slow to come.
So, as the president, if you're President Cyril Ramaphosa at this point in time, you're headed to an investment conference next week, you get, let's just say, you get downgraded by Moody's in terms of your outlook from stable to negative on Friday. What message do you head into next week with?
I think it's a matter of showing you're resolved by, you know, announcing in terms of big action. One, we still need a CEO for Eskom. We hear from the budget speech that there's going to be an announcement and a change in the board positions. So the people that you put there and the mandate that you give them, but also insulating them from the political figures that exist, to make sure that they implement the right the right decisions to turn around Eskom, because you know, we can say whatever we want. Eskom's debt ultimately South Africa's debt, and we have to deal with it one way or the other. And if we don't, it means the fiscal risk will remain with us.
Considering the deterioration in whether it be debt, whether it be in revenue collection as well, 53 billion rand less than was estimated in February, would you then say that we still have some sort of political desire to actually want to solve the problem? Because if that, I feel that if that was the case, we would have been a whole lot more stern. We would have been a whole lot more ambitious in trying to curb the expenditure, cut out a whole lot of other things that perhaps are still sitting in our fiscus.
I think it's 53 billion for the current fiscal year. You have another 80 billion next year and 114 billion the year after in revenue shortfalls. So that is combined about 250 billion revenue shortfall, and the economy remains quite weak. Political desire, I think we are out of options. It's either we are going to be forced to make the decisions because the economy will approach a fiscal cliff. That's one option. Or we do them now when we still have the option to actually choose what we implement. Ultimately, the political leadership would have to take those decisions.
Yeah. Very finally, as I thank you, where it's easy to be negative, as I've said to a few of our guests as well, I want to get some positives from you as well with regards to our budget.
I think the one positive that National Treasurer was very honest about where we find ourselves as a country. It's very difficult. The hard decisions have to be taken, cutting the wage bill. But there are avenues where we can actually insulate part of society that is going to be impacted by the reforms. I think those avenues are well ventilated, which can say society can agree, let's do these things, but in the interim we're going to cushion those that are going to be impacted negatively. But if you look at even in terms of wage growth for people that are employed by government, we still see real positive growth in their wages. That should be positive, even though it remains negative from a wage bill point of view.
Fantastic. Azam, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, then the Executive Chief Economist then at Alexander Forbes, having joined us in studio to get some quick reaction and perhaps summarizing some of his thoughts with regards to the medium-term budget policy statement 2019, having been delivered then by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni not so long ago. We do conclude as well our presentation right here outside the steps of Parliament then as well, where we of course got that MTBPS announcement. Then the interesting facets here are that we certainly need to get a growth picture that perhaps is more intent on trying to resolve South Africa's three-pronged problems, of course, of inequality, joblessness that South Africa continues to have as well at this point in time, and how exactly we begin to fix the fiscus and ensure that it grows beyond the current status. Have we done enough, whether it be with regards to Eskom or any other SOE for that matter, realizing that SAA itself currently in its current state will not be able to make enough cash flow to warrant its existence as it currently stands? So how do we fix that as perhaps a big issue as well? So the SOEs need to find some sort of way to resolve themselves, whether it's in the form of leadership, whether it's in the form of just managing the costs that are certainly derived from these entities, is going to be quite critical as well. But also, we as citizens also need to play our part. The consideration that we continuously ask government to do everything for us perhaps is a notion that we need to put aside for a little bit and continue to ask ourselves what we can do for our country. I leave it right there, and that's where the buck stops indeed. It's back to studio right now. Thank you so much for joining us for our live broadcast right here outside the steps of Parliament for the Medium-Term Budget Policy Statement 2019.
It is a little after 1600 hours Central Africa time. A very good afternoon to you and welcome to SA Today on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. Coming to you live From SABC News Studios in Auckland Park, my name is Palesa Chibisi, and let us say thank you very much to SABC News team who've been in Parliament, Arabile Gumede and the entire team there, of course, delivering the medium-term budget policy statement as presented earlier today by the Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni. We'll continue, of course, to dissect parts of the statement as presented by the Minister. My colleague Colin Limawani is standing by. But just before we do that, let's just catch you up with some top stories for today.
The consequence of not acting now would be grave for South Africa. Over time, the country would likely face mounting debt service costs and higher interest rates and may enter a debt trap.
Our top story, Finance Minister Tito Mboweni sounds the alarm over the country's debt. And violent scenes in the Cape Town city centre. More than 100 people have been arrested after a tense standoff between the police and the refugees in that place. And in sport, cricket, South Africa has confirmed that it has suspended 3 senior officials over players and player contracts. A very good afternoon to you once again. Our top story this hour takes us to Cape Town, where tensions are running high in the Cape Town city centre. About 100 people have been arrested at the Waldorf building in Cape Town following clashes between police and foreign nationals. The clashes broke out as police are prepared to remove the hundreds of people who've been staging a sit-in outside the offices of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. They say they feel unsafe in South Africa and are demanding to be repatriated back to their home countries or countries that will accept them. The group had been staging a sit-in at the building for several weeks now, alleging that they are being attacked by South Africans. And as reported, over 100 people have been arrested at the Waldorf building in Cape Town following clashes between the police and foreign nationals. The clashes broke out as police are prepared to remove the hundreds of refugees who have been staging a sit-in outside the offices of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. This in the CBD for the past 3 weeks. Our reporter Arabile Gumede earlier spoke to the Home Affairs Department's Director General following that particular standoff.
What we are having is a situation where we have people whose status have not been determined even by ourselves, who are claiming that they are refugees in South Africa. Some of them are asylum seekers. Some of them are claiming to be failed asylum seekers because when their status was determined, obviously they failed to be confirmed as refugees, so they appeal some of the decisions they are making. But basically, I've tried to engage with them. On the 21st of October, we had a meeting with them in Pretoria. Yesterday, we also tried to set up a meeting for today to meet with some of the organizers. They blatantly said they're not prepared to meet with us any further because their interest at this point in time is that they want to go to any other country other than South Africa. They don't want to be repatriated to their countries of origin because they're saying that they came in South Africa because they are persecuted from where they come from. The reality is that South Africa, every time when we do a determination of those who are claiming asylum, we have found that almost 95% of people claiming asylum in South Africa actually are economic migrants. So they do not fall under any category of the definition of the United Nations about people seeking protection. So that's where we are. So the police, obviously, they have a responsibility together with the city to apply bylaws, for an example, because people cannot get together or sleep even in a place that is not designated and cause all other health-related hazards. So the police and the city have taken an action in that regard. So therefore, that's what resulted in the declaration this morning. So we do believe that there is a need for enforcement because ours as Department of Home Affairs is that if there's somebody who's illegal in the country, we'll have to arrest for deportation. So if really there are issues relating to that, ours is to invoke our powers in relation to arrest for deportation.
All right, so let's shift our focus back to one of the top stories of today, of course. That's the medium-term budget policy statement presented earlier today by the Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni. So, Colin, really mixed reaction to the speech itself. Some people saying that there's really nothing new. Some people saying there's a tangible plan that can actually turn things around for the economy. But some saying that tough decisions really have to be taken going forward.
Yeah, Palisa, well, a tough one, especially when you look at the economic outlook having to be revised negatively or downwards, and assessing the economic situation in the country right down to the gauntlet. We just want to find out and pick the Joburg brains as we've been listening to the analysis of economists who have been spoken to, as well as political reactions from the steps of Parliament. One can only ask the question, is the South African economy really on a path to recovery? Are we coming out of the goods yet, or are we rather the woods, and are we facing rather the final darkest hour before things become alright? Well, let's look at this story before we get to that analysis. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni painted a grim economic outlook for the country in his speech earlier, and then he told Parliament that revenue collection and the shortfalls thereof, as well as high debt servicing costs, are putting severe strain on the fiscus. He warned that things need to be done differently in the country, and if the economy is to return to meaningful economic growth. So the minister says debt will most likely exceed 70% of GDP in the next 3 years, while current account deficit is expected to remain at 3.5% of GDP over the next 3 years.
Clearly, we need to do things differently. As things stand, without any policy adjustments, debt will most likely exceed 70% of GDP by 2022-23. This is a serious position that we find ourselves in. Our little Arlo Ferox is not doing very well, Mr. President. It needs attention, like our public finances. Honorable members, there's no status quo option. Stabilization involves difficult decisions that imply sacrifices by all of us. Slowing growth in the compensation bill and additional revenue measures will be needed. The consequence of not acting now would be grave for South Africa. Over time, the country would likely face mounting debt service costs and higher interest rates, and may enter a debt trap. The unemployment crisis would worsen, and government debt could balloon.
Right, let's get analysis of the post-budget speech. And we have in the studio Owen Kumalo, who is the CEO of Weaver Investment. Thank you very much for being patient and staying with us.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks for having me in the studio.
Before I ask you how this budget grabs you, what do you make out of economic recovery versus economic stability when you look at the way things are in the country at the moment?
Well, certainly we're far from being economically stable, because you can see we just avoided a technical recession by a whisker, and the projection going forward in terms of economic growth is not looking great. Given the challenges that we face as an economy and as a country, we're far off from being economically stable. So we need to stimulate economic growth. That's the bottom line.
So then how do you get your ducks in a row when you are highly indebted? I mean, when you look at the tax obligations and you have a shortfall of 53 billion rand, when actually 2 years ago you were stuck at 50 billion.
Exactly. So you could look at that to say, well, we've been stagnant in terms of fixing the fiscal problem from where we were 2 years ago. So as you point out, shortfall in terms of revenue collection, 53 billion rand. That's not a small number, and it's a number that worries the markets. It's a number that worries the rating agencies as well, because they were watching this medium-term budget speech very closely, because Moody's is coming out in 2 days' time to make an announcement in terms of the assessment of where we are, and I think there's a bit of the finance minister actually, if you look at it high level, he did a good job of painting a broad picture of the reality that we're facing. As he put it, it's a mixed picture, but with some positives. But he was honest enough to highlight the challenges that we're facing. And people might be disappointed in terms of there was not much detail in terms of how do we get out of here, how do we dig ourselves out of this hole, and the implementation plans in detail, especially around how do we stimulate economic growth. So he outlaid broad plans around how we do that. So there's no quick fix. I think a sober assessment of the problem is a good start, and then we can implement. We can start working on the plans and implement over the medium to long term. But I think where probably the highest amount of disappointment will come from is a plan around ESCOM, the debt that ESCOM is sitting with, and the fact that the finance minister said, well, you have to wait for February to allow for the numbers to come out. Then we can't break with protocol. I think given the short-term constraints we have in terms of the fiscus, and also facing a potential downgrade in terms of outlook from Moody's from stable to negative, probably by as soon as Friday, people are expecting at least a break from protocol to say, these are not ordinary times, these are extraordinary times. Let's break with protocol and say, in this medium budget term policy statement, we're going to give you a little bit of detail to calm the markets, to calm investors, and also to calm the rating agencies. Unfortunately, that didn't come through.
If one were to look at the task of chopping down a baobab tree, I mean, you can imagine how really wide the stem is.
Yeah.
Do you think that the interventionist approach in as far as SOEs are concerned, especially with the 26 billion rand injection into ESCOM, and then doing this GTD kind of a transformation generation model in terms of generation, transmission and distribution, is it really going to work when you are now not going to get equity, but rather training these institutions and encouraging them not to be as business as usual, but rather profit-generating entities?
Yeah. Certainly the proposals do make sense, and they're welcome. And I think people might say, well, we are ESCOM fatigued, because there's so much focus on ESCOM and with other SOEs like Denel and SAA and that are loss-making as well. But ESCOM is critical. Now, the minister talked about boosting our manufacturing base. Now, a huge component into the input costs in